Hi everyone, welcome. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. My name is Daniel Truckenbrough and I'm a marketing assistant for early childhood products at Brooks Publishing. And I'm very happy to have Trina Spencer with us today to talk about promoting language via oral storytelling. And before we start, I'd just like to give you a few tips for viewing today's webinar. To kind of save bandwidth, if you're using any other applications such as email or internet browsers, you can close those just to help make sure you have enough bandwidth to watch today's webinar. If you have any questions, you can type those into the questions section of your webinar panel. And to minimize the panel, to give you more viewing space, you can click the little orange arrow here at the top of your webinar panel, and that'll minimize it, and then you can also expand it as well, clicking that arrow again. And if you experience any audio issues while you're viewing today's webinar, you can go to the audio section of the webinar panel and there's an option for dialing in using your phone, and that usually gets rid of any audio issues that you may be having. And just a few other reminders, you will receive a follow-up email tomorrow, that will have a link to the recording of this webinar as well as a link to the slide handouts. And you also receive a link to the certificate in that email as well. And with that, I will go ahead and turn it over to Trina for the presentation.
Great. Thank you, Daniel. Okay, so we don't have a lot of time, but this is a really fun topic. I hope it moves quickly and you get something useful out of it. I've organized the slides to present why oral storytelling, because we have to understand why it's so important, and then what you would be teaching if you're going to use oral storytelling in your class or at home with parents, with families, whatever it is. You need to know what it is you would want to teach children, and then how to do that. I'm going to give you some guidelines and some ideas about how to go about doing that. And because I'm sure it's on everybody's mind, I'm just going to get this question out of the way right up front. Oral storytelling and everything I'm telling you in these slides and this little coffee chat can be done through virtual means. So I have done virtual lessons with kids, or you can even just call them on the phone, do a little video chat through WhatsApp, whatever it is. You don't need materials, you don't need anything but two people in an engaging storytelling conversation. So let's go ahead and get started, and I'm sure you're going to have more questions about the hows at the end. All right, so a narrative. Narrative, of course, is a story, right? But here's the definition of that. It is a monologic telling or retelling of a specific event. And the event can be real or fantasy. And monologic really just means like somebody is monologuing, right? But it's in story fashion. Another definition would be causally related events told in sequence. Now, not every culture explains or tells stories in the same sequence, but in the US macro culture, there is a specific set of elements, and they're usually taught in a standard order. All right, here's the why section. Storytelling, in my opinion, and actually there's a ton of research to support it, is a very magical kind of thing. I mean, who doesn't love stories, right? So we know from research that oral storytelling of young children actually predicts academic performance when they're older. So there's a ton of research that says children who enter school at age of 5 that have good oral storytelling abilities have a reduced chance of having academic problems, and it predicts reading comprehension specifically all the way out to 2nd, 4th, and 8th grades, right? So storytelling is also very integrated. There's a lot of things that are happening when somebody's storytelling. We use our cognitive skills, we use meta-linguistic and metacognitive skills, we use executive functioning, short-term memory, especially about verbal things, eye contact, other things, attention, things that are going on at the same time we're storytelling. So it's a very sophisticated type or modality of communication, and many things are integrated in that process. So it's also a very common medium of socialization. About 70% of stories that are told by young children are personal, so they use it to socialize. So stories are used to like hang out with your friends. Maybe when we go do something with our own friends, we're usually telling stories about something that's happened to us or our children, or something related to somebody else's story. But the same thing happens with young children. We use the stories for socialization and interacting with friends and parents and teachers. Storytelling has also been considered a sense-making device. In other words, we use that format of a story to help understand experiences. And then that understanding helps us derive some appropriate actions to solve problems. Okay, that's the reason why narratives or stories are used in therapy. So I also want to suggest that individuals from all cultures tell stories, and the stories are very culturally relevant. So you can have a story that's adapted or came from a particular culture, and that it would be completely familiar within that culture. And then we can also use stories to transmit cultural knowledge, and that's very common in oral storytelling traditions, to teach a lesson to the younger generations as they gain knowledge of their culture. It's also very ubiquitous. Like, it's common practice for young kids, older kids, adults. We just tell stories all the time. And we almost do it so naturally, we don't even realize that that's what we're doing. And oftentimes we miss how useful they are. We use stories in schools to assess children's academic performance, what they understand, and even to promote other skills like, let's say, eye contact or friendshipping skills. So it's an extremely useful modality of communication. Okay, so you're also thinking, why am I not promoting storybooks? I am promoting storybooks, but there are some advantages of oral storytelling over storybook reading. First, families from all SES groups use oral storytelling. So you actually do not need to be literate or to have access to books. And families from low SES groups tend to fall in that category. Either reading is difficult for them, or they have low literate skills, or maybe very little access to books. But oral storytelling, you don't need any of those. Oral stories are more likely to be child-friendly, maybe shorter, more personally relevant to children, and very culturally grounded. Oral storytelling reduces the need for background knowledge to understand the story. Oftentimes in books, the stories are unrelated to children's lives, and so they have a harder time making that relevant or understanding like the main lesson. Also, there's research to suggest that adults naturally use more sophisticated talk during oral storytelling than they do during shared book reading or conversation. And that's actually like the sophistication of language that we use is one of the reasons why it's so useful and is so connected to academic skills. Oral storytelling allows for more intimate talk around emotions. And there's research that indicates children whose parents encourage kind of like an emotional exchange around stories, their children have fewer behavior problems and better social skills. Oral stories are also flexible, adjustable, developmentally appropriate, and they can foster social engagement because there's not a book between you and the child. So if the adult and the child are looking face to face, it can foster some of the maybe nonverbal social aspects of interacting with people. And they're also easier to repeat, which increases the impact on language production and comprehension skills. So the more a child can retell a story, right, and practice that language, the more it's going to be useful. But a really long story that a child wouldn't be able to remember is not as helpful because he won't be able to repeat it. Okay, I'm going to just hit this really quickly. This is how academically relevant they are. These are from kindergarten Common Core standards in the language arts. Every single one of these is about storytelling. Okay, in some way, and there's actually more than this that are related to storytelling, but this is what would fit on this page. So these are kindergarten standards. So in kindergarten, kids are expected to create and tell an original story, describe character, setting, and beginning and middle and end of a story in proper sequence, right? That's just an example. Okay, we also believe and understand that oral narrative language is a foundation to build other kinds of academic language, because if children are not able to say something, they can't write it. And so we want to build oral storytelling before we have them engage in written storytelling. We also know it builds reading comprehension and vocabulary. And we also have a number of research studies that suggest if children know narrative language, they're able to detect the patterns and listen for the patterns in informational discourse. And of course, we can always teach domain knowledge in a context and in a structure that is more familiar to kids, like story structure. Now, socially, you imagine that you're having a conversation, but it's an oral storytelling conversation. There's eye contact going on, there's turn taking, some theory of mind. We have to understand your partner or your conversational partner or your friend's intentions or what they're understanding. We have to engage in emotions, and there's even problem solving involved, right? If we understand the pattern of stories and can help children identify actions that they might take to solve a problem, then we're teaching them how to solve those problems. I also believe that empowering children to be able to tell stories about their own lives gives them a mechanism to ask for help, maybe protection against abuse or mistreatment or neglect, because they actually have the ability to tell somebody about their experience. Okay, so let's switch over to the what's. So narratives contain story grammar. These are the patterns. It has character, problem, feeling, action, ending, and those would be appropriate for 3 to 5-year-old children. And as children age, you would add on more complexity, more story grammar components. Narratives also have this complex language, and I'm just going to identify them as sentences that use these words: because, so that, when, after, and then modifiers, of course, things like adjectives and adverbs, right? But we want children, and in narratives, they tend to use more complex language because you need something more precise to tell somebody about something that they didn't experience. And then, of course, vocabulary. There's less common but useful words that can be transmitted and taught and understood in the context of stories. So here's an example. I'm pulling a couple examples from my own research. At the top, there's like a 3-sequence picture set that kind of give a beginning, middle, and end. But if you notice, 3 of my story grammar elements, the character, problem, and feeling, are pictured in the first one. The action, which is depicted by the yellow star, is in the middle, and the ending is the end. Where sometimes I like to teach, especially young children, using 5 panels, 5 pictures, so that I can separate them and make it very clear that there's more refined structures than just beginning, middle, and end. And in fact, beginning, middle, and end is pretty rough, even though you see that in many of the early learning standards. It's not as sophisticated as knowing you need a character, some sort of problem, a feeling that's attached and causally related to that problem, some sort of attempt to solve the problem, and an ending, like what's the resolution of this, okay? So here's an example of a story. Yesterday, Nola was playing on the playground. Some of the children started to make fun of her. Nola felt sad because her friends were being mean. She talked to her teacher about it. Her patient teacher said, "I will talk to them." After Nola's teacher talked to the children, they apologized. Nola was happy. They said they were sorry. So I've kind of highlighted some of the complexity. The 2 sentences that are underlined have subordinate clauses in them, and we can tell that they are because the words because and after are used. So even if we don't understand subordinate clauses and linguistics, we don't need to. As long as we're using sentences that have these kind of words in it, that sentence is going to be complex, and we want to model that to kids. There's also like a word, apologize, that would be unfamiliar. And there was a context clue. I said they said they were sorry, so gave a clue about that word. So in this one little story, there's so many things that we could be teaching a child about how to solve some of these problems, social emotional things, how to be kind to your friends, plus vocabulary, complex language, and the story grammar. All right, let's get to how. This is the part you really need, right? If you're gonna now. I recognize that some of you and many of you are probably fantastic storytellers already. So this would be more of just a little bit of guidance to make sure that you've got all the knowledge you need to go forward and help kids, okay? And of course, these things work with older kids, not just younger kids, but any age individual. But relatively speaking, you would want to start with an easy story and build towards more difficult storytelling tasks. So the things on the left, so oral stories are easier than written stories. Retelling a story is easier than generating a story, right? Personally relevant stories, or telling a story about something I experience, is easier than making up something, right? There are, of course, nuances, right? Or idiosyncratic characteristics of children. But if that was the case, you would probably wonder if they had some sort of disability, if one of these isn't exactly right. So if they were able to tell fictional stories and generating stories but not retell, I might be concerned about their comprehension abilities. And then lastly is pictures. Certainly using some sort of visuals to support this storytelling would make it easier than if there were no pictures available. Now, here is my tips for how to do this. You do not need materials. You do not need the visuals, okay? The active ingredient is actually modeling stories and having children retell it. That's it. That's the most important part. That's why you could do it on the phone, you could do it through videos, you could do it anywhere and about anything. Very, very flexible. You just want to model a story that would be somewhat relevant. You can make it up or you can plan it ahead of time. If you plan it ahead of time, you might be able to identify some vocabulary words or something specific that you want to target. But if you make it up, all you need to do is remember, oh, I got to have a character, a problem, a feeling, an action, and an ending in that. Okay? And then once you've told that story, you ask the child to retell it. Now, you want to, over time, you want to use many different stories rather than repeating the same story on consecutive sessions, right? On Monday, you tell a story about, this little kid forgetting his shoes, right? On the next day, somebody's playing with a toy that they want to. So you want to change up the stories, but you want to make sure every story has that same pattern of character, problem, feeling, action, and ending. And then you also want to avoid lengthy definitions. Like, I don't need to explain what a character is. I don't need to explain what a problem is. Just name them, like this is a character, this is a problem, and move on, because the children will learn the pattern just by presenting many different stories over time. Okay? All right, you can use pictures and icons. Props are sometimes useful, and gestures. I use gestures to teach kids. This is character, this is problem, this is feeling, this is action, and this is ending. All right, and then you don't need any visuals whatsoever. You can teach them the gestures, and kids can be interactive while you're telling the story, and while you're listening to the story, you can interact without having to disrupt their story. If you do use visuals, you want to fade them quickly because you don't want kids to be dependent on that. You also can model complex sentences and then prompt children to use them, right? So words or sentences that have these words in them would be complex, all right? And you want to model a variety of sentences, even if the children are not able to use those words yet, those long sentences, but you can prompt ones that are within their zone of proximal development. And I have ordered them from easiest to hardest. So because is the easiest, then when, after, so that, before, and although, and they have some sort of developmental trajectory. And then all you would do is model the sentence to say, listen, he was sad because he got injured. Now you say it, right? That's all it is. Model it, prompt it. All right, so you can also extend past the modeling and retelling. You can say something like, has something like that ever happened to you? Tell me about it. Or tell me a story about a time when you were sad, sick, frustrated, scared, whatever. Some other extensions, if a child is telling you a story or a group of kids are telling you a story, you can draw on a whiteboard. We call this pictography. So you can draw the elements. You could also do, now I modeled this story to a whole class, now turn and talk to your neighbor and retell that story to your friend, right? So you got two kids telling stories to each other and then taking turns so the other one gets to tell it too. You can also set up opportunities, so you could do snack and share. So if you're an early childhood classroom, you could have snack, or maybe you have snack through a Zoom call with a kid. Hey, let's eat snack together, and all you're gonna do is sit there and eat, and you're gonna tell stories to that kid and say, okay, now you tell me that story. Or then say, has something like that happened to you? Tell me that story. I also want to suggest that transitions are a good time for storytelling. Kids are often standing in line, waiting to brush their teeth, waiting to wash their hands, or waiting to go to the bathroom. That's a good time to say, okay, turn and talk to your friend. This is a transition, listen, right? And they would be then listening to their friend or listening to you tell the story. So you always want to encourage spillover, because this is about language, and now that you understand that there's story grammar, complex language, and vocabulary, you can extend all of those things into these things like drawing, dictating, writing. There can be take-home activities where kids can take something home and share something with their friend. And I would consider shared storybook reading as an extension, so that you can get a storybook that has good storytelling structure in it, and also review vocabulary words. And then of course you just want to draw attention to the students' use of complex sentences, use of their words in other contexts, and encourage children to use and define words. Use the story grammar to promote social emotional health. So like when there's an emotional difficulty, you can say that I can understand that you would feel sad about, right? and then use your story grammar framework to teach problem solving. So this is the ask, and all I really wanted to say about it is that I have used the story grammar framework and the underlined words, that complex language and vocabulary, in the creation of the assessment of story comprehension. The things in purple indicate inferential questions. So asking kids, well, why do you think Carlos's mom gave him a hug, right? So getting kids to think a little bit outside of what was in the story. And the ask, of course, is part of the Millie Suite published by Brooks. And I use some of the materials from my research that are at www.languagedynamicsgroup.com or at my personal website, which is trinastoolbox.com. So some of the resources and materials you saw in here are available at one of those websites. Okay, I'm done. Daniel.
All right, great. Thank you so much, Trina. So just a few quick things before we open it up for questions. And again, if you have any questions that you would like to ask, you can submit those in the questions section of your webinar panel. So today, or for this webinar, we will be giving away 3 copies of the Assessment of Story Comprehension set that Trina was just talking about to 3 viewers today. So you'll receive an email after the webinar if you've been selected. And if you can progress to the next slide. And you can also save 20% on most products at brookspublishing.com using the code CoffeeTalk, and you can just enter that into your checkout discount code box when you're checking out. And can go to the next slide. And if you'd like more professional development opportunities, we have plenty of other coffee chats that are scheduled and that have already run, so you can watch any of those recordings in the previously presented webinars tab, but you can also see our upcoming schedule as well and register for those webinars at the bit.ly that is on your screen there. And we also have additional COVID-19 resources available for early childhood professionals, including recommended reading, downloadable resources, and other professional development webinars as well. And those can be accessed using that bit.ly there. Okay, and now we will open it up for questions. So we did have a few entered, and again, if you have any questions that you would like answered, you can just enter those into the questions tab of your webinar panel. So Trina, we have a listener that was wondering how caregivers of infants or toddlers can overcome the obstacle of reading or storytelling with a face mask on.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the best thing to do is to get as close as possible to children and use very animated expressions that the child can see. So eyes, hands, be very animated in other aspects of your communication to the children. And those are really important things. So don't dismiss them. Mouths are important, but they're not the only thing that's important when you're engaged in oral storytelling.
Great. We also have a couple of listeners that were looking for tips for keeping a child's attention during storytelling.
Yeah, well, my tips would be to be very animated, right? And I think that's one of the reasons why I don't always want to read books, because I think the interpersonal connection can be stronger. And then if you're creating a story that's relevant to that child, they're going to be like, whoa, wait, you're talking about me, or hey, that happened to me once. So that's what I mean by really flexible, is that you can switch up your story. I'm not a very creative person, but I can figure out something, and I'm just going to make some weird thing up that will draw the child's attention based on what they're interested in or what they might be able to relate to. Okay.
And keeping in line with the tips, we also have a listener that was wondering if you have any tips for new storytellers or those who may not feel completely comfortable storytelling.
Yeah. I would say, like I said, I'm not a creative person, but I love kids. So like if you can just engage with kids and think about what experiences they have, like what's important to this child, right? I kind of come up with things, what I call kernels, and I watch kids and watch them about like what is it they're experiencing. And I learned that, you know, kids have these little tussles with a friend over a toy. They both wanted to play with something. Or this kid is sitting in my chair, or they can't watch TV because their brother or their sister is on the TV, or they can't talk to anybody because mom is working. You know, all those kinds of things that are relevant to them. And doesn't just try to like add the character, the setting, the feeling, just add around that little kernel, right? But try really hard to make it relevant to children and maybe have them co-tell it with you, right? Maybe they would make up parts of that story. Or I might get the character, the problem, and then say, well, how do you think he feels about that? Right? And get the kid to contribute. So then you're co-telling with the child. And then we could say, well, what do you think he should do to fix the problem? Right? So you can use some questioning to help get the story out and engage the child into something that's more interesting to him or her.
Excellent, thank you. And again, another listener asking for tips for storytelling with children that are developing their native language, so not in English-speaking classrooms.
Yes, excellent. So, as to the extent possible, they should be encouraged to tell stories in their native language. It's one of the things that I really like about involving the families, because you may not be a speaker of their native language. If you are, of course, tell the stories in both languages, and you could, you know, make it up and rephrase in both languages if you want, and have the child practice in both languages. I would start with the language that they're strongest in, their most dominant language, do that story first, and then do somewhat of a translation in the second one, but it doesn't have to be an exact translation. Also, if you're gonna encourage families, which this is something you should do, encourage families to use oral storytelling, encourage them to do the storytelling in their native language. It's also, especially when children are emerging English speakers, they may hear a story in English, but not be able to retell the story in English. They could retell it in Spanish, right? So if you don't speak Spanish, you tell a child a story in English and then say, now go tell your mom that story in Spanish, right? Then they might be able to get that practice in their native language. And keep in mind the patterns, the character, problem, feeling, action, ending, those things, they're actually transportable across languages. So, and Spanish and English has, you know, there are some minor differences, but not enough to change the way you would facilitate that across languages.
Excellent, thank you, Trina. And we also have another listener that was wondering, in addition to gestures, do you also recommend using tone of voice and pitch to engage children?
Yeah, absolutely. Certainly, I also like to put dialogue into stories, and you should definitely say the dialogue part different than the narrative part. Um, Tone of voice, anything that you can do that's going to support comprehension of that story, I would do that.
Excellent. And another listener was wondering, do you have any suggestions for storytelling through Zoom, or I guess through any other sort of virtual platform?
Yeah, there is. I mean, I don't think it's a whole lot different. The primary difference is behavior management, right? How they are on the other side. That if you have them with you, you can kind of manage them. But if you have a child on the other side, and the parent is helping, you know, keep them in a location, I guess that would be necessary. But honestly, the video, like Zoom or, you know, GoToMeetings, whatever, there's so many great platforms. I would just try to get the kid and you to be as close to the video as possible and use lots of animation. There is actually, I have a demonstration lesson that I think it's available, and maybe will be available sometime later this week if you want to watch me doing a storytelling session with I think she was 4 years old, a 4-year-old, and you know, she was a little wiggly, you know, but I used a lot of animation and brought her back in, and you know, I could tell that I was more animated and keyed into her behavior through the Zoom. You also want to keep them short, right? You don't need to make them very long. They can be quite short. All you need to do is model and have the child retell, and you know, continue to model until that child retells a story completely. asking questions, facilitating the most complete story possible.
Great. Thank you, Trina. And we'll take just one more question to stay within our time frame. Oh, I just lost it here. Are the resources and tips that you've provided during this presentation, are they really just for younger children, or can they be for children of all ages?
For children of all ages and of all abilities. That's actually one of the things I love the most about storytelling is they're super adaptable. So we have tons of research with typically developing kids all the way up to third grade. And so that means even children with disabilities who are fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh graders, and they have language like a third grader would still be totally appropriate. And we use storytelling even in middle school and high school, but these are like foundational skills that they really need in early childhood. We also have research with children with disabilities, 3-year-olds with disabilities who don't speak English as a first language. So it's something that can be adapted down and adapted up really easily. If it's older and more developed language skills, then you would just add more story grammar parts like the setting, an end feeling, a plan, or maybe an unresolved problem and another try to fix the problem, more emotions. You know, you would just elaborate on the story grammar and of course elaborate on the sentences as well. And then if it's if it's a young child with fewer language skills, then I would just focus on just getting complete sentences, and maybe they only tell 3 sentences about the problem, the action, and the ending. That's what you need to make a story.
Great. And we actually just got one more question that I think may be good for the audience. So do you have any ideas for open-ended questions to ask children when reading?
Um, yeah, I really like questions like, what do you think he should do? Or what can he do to fix this problem? Or um, what do you think he should do next? Right? So kind of like prediction questions about things that he can do or a child can do. I really like things that are around problem solving, right? And then any kind of emotions that, or any kind of questions that connect emotion words, I think are very valuable, especially with young children. Like, I don't think we talk enough about emotions and we don't teach empathy as explicitly as we could. But by saying things like, how do you think he feels? Or how would you feel if this happened to you? Right? Those are a set of questions that would facilitate a conversation about thinking about somebody else's problem.
Excellent. Well, that was a fantastic presentation. Thank you so much, Trina. And thank you everyone for joining us for today's webinar. And again, you'll receive a follow-up email tomorrow that will have a link to the recording of today's webinar, as well as a link to the handouts and a link to your certificate as well. All right. So thank you, everyone.